What's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, then welcome to our little corner of the internet. Today we're going to be watching a video titled USA Today If the South Won the Civil War, which yesterday we were watching a video about the Civil War and I was completely amused. So I think this is going to be interesting. Without further ado, let's see what this video is about.
Appomattox, 1865. Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, battle-worn and exhausted, sit across from each other. Their faces are etched with the weight of a divided nation. The room is tense, every moment heavy with history. Then, with a single fateful pen stroke, they bring 4 years of unimaginable bloodshed to an end. The United States Civil War is over, and jubilant cheers rise from the men in gray. The Confederacy has won. How did this happen, and what comes now for the two nations that were now one?
I would never ever imagine, I couldn't even imagine what it would be like.
Out on this episode of the Infographics Show, USA Today If the South Won the Civil War. What if the South won the Civil War? It might just be the most popular alternate history hypothetical in the world. The question has fueled countless books, theories, and debates, and even a darkly satirical film called CSA, Confederate States of America. It depicted a horrific future where the South overran the North, re-legalized slavery nationwide, and created a country entirely based around human bondage. Fast forward 140 years, there is an America where slaves are sold on the Home Shopping Network. Was this disturbing future close to happening? In a word, no. While Southern war songs might have boasted about sweeping into Washington and hanging old Abe, it was really just a fantasy. The Confederate Army was primarily composed of draftees, lacked the resources of the federal government, and was focused on its own claimed territory. Despite surprising the North early in the war and even making bold forays into states like Pennsylvania, they were met with fierce resistance and bogged down at critical points. Any victory would have more likely resulted in their borders being recognized, not the stars and bars flying over the White House. But what about if someone else entered the fray? The Confederacy did make some moves to gain foreign allies, but success was limited. The British were no doubt still smarting from their 2 losses to the U.S. and would love revenge. But they abolished slavery in 1834 and likely saw the Confederates as the worse option. France had also abolished slavery and was in the middle of a tumultuous century. It had little.
This responds my question of if other countries had slavery as well. Because yesterday I was thinking about how would Europe, I wonder how other countries reacted to the fact that America had this situation going on, but clearly it was obviously it was going on. They were the ones who brought them. But still, I don't know.
Interest in involving itself in America's conflicts. Spain, while still maintaining colonies in the Americas, was situated too close to the Confederacy to be of real strategic help, which means the South's best bet was
you're on your own, cabrons.
Elections in the North. Abraham Lincoln loomed high in the public eye during the war, but he still had to win re-election in the middle of it. His opponent was his former general, George McClellan, who had been fired by Lincoln and definitely held a grudge. While George McClellan was undoubtedly pro-Union, he was also deeply skeptical about the war's mounting costs. If he wins and the North faces setbacks, he might persuade the public it's better to let the South go than to keep shedding blood over slavery. And all of American history is different. So now what? Far more issues would have had to be settled immediately. Starting a new country isn't easy, and it's especially hard when it's dividing an existing country in two. Among the first issues that would have to be settled is the border. There were countless families divided on both sides of the line. Imagine if Grandma lives in Virginia and the rest of the family lives in Maryland. Over the river and through the woods is now a passport situation. And that's just the start of the new country's border troubles. The Confederacy had recently gained much of its territory before the war via the annexation of Texas from Mexico. This was a highly thorny issue that the Mexicans were still smarting over. So the Confederate States would now potentially be facing hostile borders on both sides and would no doubt be hoping to quickly establish diplomatic relations. Similar to when the U.S. gained independence, the war ending doesn't mean another isn't around the corner. The U.S. might be sorely tempted to back Mexico in an attempt to weaken the new potential enemy on their doorstep. But
everything should have gone, if they were to win and actually maintain, everything should have been different from the start, because it's nearly impossible like this. It just wouldn't be impossible in nowadays 8 days and age if everything else went as it went.
Confederacy has one big ace up its sleeve. Why was the South so determined to keep slavery? It wasn't solely racism, it was far more useful to them than it would be in the North, thanks to their huge agricultural sector. Unlike the North, which could abolish slavery with minimal impact, the South relied on an enslaved labor to sustain its vast plantation system. With control over a significant portion of the continent's food supply, the South held a strong bargaining chip. With westward expansion underway, the North would likely push for trade agreements and border access, prompting immediate diplomatic talks. And if they succeeded would depend on one big factor: who was leading them? There was only one president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, and he would serve for a 6-year term in this timeline. Davis was seen as a ruthless but pragmatic man who would likely have never been open to negotiations with his defeated rivals. But he couldn't run for re-election per the Confederate Constitution, which meant that someone new would hold the future in his hands. The victorious General Robert E. Lee would be a favorite, the same way Ulysses S. Grant was, but Lee was reportedly doggedly apolitical and might have declined to serve, which leaves a sharply forked path for the Confederacy. The Confederacy had some moderates high up, including Vice President Alexander Stephens, who initially advocated against secession and served as governor of Georgia after the war. And then there was Judah P. Benjamin, the Confederacy's Secretary of State and Attorney General at different points. Benjamin was seen as a canny negotiator and once proposed freeing slaves who fought for the Confederacy. Either one likely would have brought a more moderate touch to the new government, but it's not clear if either one could have won an election, especially since a far more fiery figure was waiting in the wings. At 36 years old, John C. Breckinridge was the youngest person ever to take the helm as Vice President of the United States, serving from
At 36 years old. Wow.
1857 to 1861. The fiery Kentuckian was picked by James Buchanan to appease angry Southerners, and he lived up to his reputation as the losing candidate against Abraham Lincoln. He immediately sided with the Confederacy and wound up being the Confederacy's last Secretary of War. As such, in this timeline, he would be seen as partially responsible for their upset victory and would likely be in pole position as a future president of the Confederacy. And that would likely lead to a lot of chaos for the Confederacy and everyone around them. With less than 20% of the people in the Confederacy owning slaves, slavery was largely a privilege of the wealthy elite, a point of pride for Confederate leadership, and they would likely lean into it under a Breckinridge presidency, causing them plenty of problems. Europe had abolished slavery decades ago, as had Canada and Mexico, making it more difficult for the new Confederacy to establish diplomatic relations. It would also potentially leave them at the
It would literally make it impossible.
mercy of their northern neighbor. And another issue could bring that crashing down and possibly even start the guns of war. In the decades leading up to the Civil War, one of the nastiest points of contention was fugitive slave patrols heading north to retrieve escaped slaves and drag them back to bondage. While they had the proper paperwork in some cases, many functioned like vigilante kidnapping gangs. And now that there's a border in place between the two nations, that's a much harder issue to resolve. A slave escaping to the free United States could be a diplomatic incident if the U.S. refused to return them, and a slave patrol being caught trying to kidnap someone in another country would be a much bigger one. So it's likely both countries might start looking elsewhere. Initially, tensions between the U.S. and the Confederacy would likely be too high for much diplomacy beyond trade. Instead, the U.S. would probably strengthen its ties with Canada and Britain. With Canada gaining more autonomy in 1867, the time is actually perfect for closer relations and maybe even a partnership. The Confederacy, meanwhile, might find Florida its most appealing real estate. It's close to the Caribbean, where many islands are still under the thumb of other colonies, and it might allow for the expansion of slavery. But the odds are it wouldn't be long before the two countries clashed once again. The Civil War happened at the height of westward expansion, and there was plenty of territory still to claim and make into states. It would likely turn into a higher stakes version of the many territorial clashes in the lead up to the Civil War.
I was thinking more like if they won, it would happen like when it happened the other way around, like the whole country would just switch to their beliefs. Obviously, this would be more reasonable and like more probable if it happened. But like, what would, like, if it was still till today, like what would happen? That's crazy. But that's just like, I want to get this age and era, because that would just not happen.
Neither country would have much hunger for another armed conflict at this point, so it's likely only minor skirmishes would happen. Eventually, a latitude line would determine where territories lay, so it's likely the states would definitely not form as they did in our timeline. But what about the people kept in bondage? Is there any hope for them? As slavery was swiftly being abolished worldwide, the Confederacy stood apart. Unlike other nations across the globe, the Confederacy's economy relied on agriculture, where enslaved labor cut costs significantly. Furthermore, slavery had become a point of pride, rooted in the very war fought to protect it. So odds are hardline presidents would bow to the plantation lobby and work to preserve it despite outside pressure. But there's gonna be a lot of that. The abolitionist movement was sweeping the world and viewed slavery with disgust. But it wasn't enough to get them to cut off relations with countries that still had it, but to start new relations with a country essentially built.
Oh, my back hurts. I know I'm moving a lot. I'm sorry. My neck and my back is killing me.
Around it? That's a trickier question. The Confederacy would likely face swift diplomatic isolation. This would be especially true if the US, a key trading partner for many nations, pressured its allies to avoid working with those dirty Rebs on the southern border. So it's likely that, like it or not, change is coming to the Confederacy. While diplomatic pressure would hurt the Confederacy, odds are that another factor would work against slavery even more: industrialization. As plows were replaced with tractors and cotton pickers with threshers, the plantations would need fewer laborers and more machines operated by trained workers. Mass slavery would soon become unprofitable, but it's unlikely that the institution would be outlawed anytime soon. Wealthy landowners with house slaves would fight tooth and nail to keep them, insisting that Old Man Herbert's just part of the family and they couldn't possibly do without him. Meanwhile, Old Man Herbert shoots daggers with his eyes behind them. But keeping slavery would set them up for trouble, and their future might look a lot like another country's. The vast majority of the black people in the United States lived in the South, even if none of them could vote. And while no new ones would be coming in except in the unlikely event of the Confederacy reinstating the slave trade, more would be born, giving them a larger percentage of the population. While the black population of the United States likely attained something close to equality ahead of schedule,
if it did happen like this, it would just result in chaos. I think everybody would try to flee. Or not maybe everyone, because I remember when they told, we watched a video about when slavery ended, a lot of the slaves didn't even want to leave. So maybe not everyone, because you're already so used to it that it's like you're becoming your reality. But I think it just would result in a whole lot of chaos.
Larger population in the Confederacy would be staring across the border with jealousy and anger. And when a population has nothing to gain from obedience, they have nothing to lose from rebellion. By the 20th century, the odds are large-scale slave rebellions would become more and more common, with the Confederacy fighting to keep them down. The United States can put the screws to its unwelcome neighbor, including offering refuge to escaped blacks from the Confederacy or aiding efforts to sanction them. And slowly, a Confederacy with slavery might look a little like apartheid-era South Africa, isolated and desperately trying to hold on to a dying system. And if it was to give in to that pressure, the future would look very different. The Confederacy would have a large black population that would likely all vote unanimously for equal rights candidates as soon as they were able to. And it probably wouldn't be long before they rallied behind one of their own. Many former slave owners would likely not be willing to live in this reformed country, so by the time the demographics shifted enough, it might actually wind up being a black-led country. Of course, people don't always take the hint.
Whoa.
There's a good chance that the Confederacy might decide not to give up power. This would potentially trigger another war between the former states, reminiscent of the War of 1812's Bloody Round 2, as it likely wouldn't stand much of a chance against the full force of world opinion and support.
So basically, the world would be eventually the same.
This would likely end with a much harsher version of Reconstruction. But one thing is for sure, the US would not be the superpower it is in this timeline. With a hostile country on its border, the US would definitely not be looking to get involved in foreign affairs as heavily. It's unlikely it would have been lured into the primarily European territorial conflict of World War I. World War II would be thornier, with the Confederacy potentially seeking out help from a country with suspiciously similar views about minorities. But the only thing that's certain is the United States today would look nothing like what it does today. And it's possible that the end of the war would have just been Act 1. How would today's USA be different if the South had won? Drop your theories below and let's get the debate going. Want to know about another iconic what if in American history? Check out what US would be like if America lost the Revolution, or watch this video instead.
I mean, yeah, this is the most probable thing that would happen. I was thinking more of like if everything was completely different, you know, but I mean, it would probably still end the same at some point because it's just there's just right from wrong, and you know. But that was still interesting, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching that with me. Thank you for joining me. Please do a like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I guess I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!